Welcome to For the Church, a podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus and his mission to reach people with the gospel and then to equip his people to worship and serve. I'm your host, Keaton Paul, and joining me is my conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. So here we are once more. We're in the midst of the summer, so it's humid, it's hot, but that also means that we just finished up the PCA's General Assembly.
And like always, we are fashionably late coming to this.
Of course we are.
Because you had ROAM immediately after GA.
That's right.
Because, I don't know, you hate yourself or something? That was a lot back to back.
It shakes out that way, yeah. We were gone for most of the month of June and a good chunk of July. So here we are back again.
Yep. All that to say, we're much later than what's nice is that we miss all of like the hot button things because you know the PCA GA, it just gets riled up, like feathers get ruffled.
Weirdly so.
We'll talk about that.
Yes.
So you just want to jump in?
Well, how are you?
I'm good. I've also been busy.
Yeah.
Less traveling so far this summer. It's about to change, but so far, yeah, we had to plan this podcast at a time when both of us would be in town because it's like every week that I'm gone for a weekend or a week you're here and then vice versa. So we've been like playing in the cracks. I feel like we haven't seen each other just as friends in so long.
Months. Because May always gets shot to pieces. Too much going on there, and then
here we are.
It's July. It's July, and before you know it, it'll be fall again. But we're not there yet. So anyway. The PCA's 52nd General Assembly took place in Chattanooga, Tennessee at some point in the month of June. I forget the exact dates, but I was there. A bunch of other PCA pastors were there, and we were there in the shadow of Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. So, a few things. But first and foremost, let's get just some definitions because talking the PCA's politics and polity are honestly kind of unique even within the Presbyterian and Reformed tradition. We have like weird idiosyncratic things. We also love to talk in acronyms of various sorts. So talking with most PCA pastors or PCA nerds about General Assembly. I almost said GA. General Assembly is like trying to talk to somebody in the military and tell me what you do, and then they just speak in like military speak. PCA people do the same thing. So then half the time you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So helpful terms. Here's our denominational structure. What does it mean to be Presbyterian, as it were? That might be a fun series to do. Now that I think about it, that's just on them. Anyway, Presbyterian. Presbyterian is actually a fancy word about our polity. Presbyterian comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which means elder. So we have elders here. And there are three courts, three different levels, if you will, of where elders who Christ has commissioned elders for the administration of word, sacrament, the discipline of the church, etc., etc. Pastors, elders, we think that's the same term used together. Three different levels or three different gatherings. There's the local level. So, the local church has its group of elders, which is called the session. I'm sure you all have heard the session before. The session is making a determination about X, Y, or Z. That is your local elders here at Zion Presbyterian Church, which are Jim Davis.
3?
Four.
4.
Yes. Mark Holly, Jim Davis, Monty Lewis, and Thomas Quinn. Those are all ruling elders. Jeff and myself are teaching elders, but we're assistant pastors, which means we're not technically on the session. Associate pastors are on the session, and quote-unquote senior pastor, lead pastor, whatever term you want to use, is also typically on the session. But since Jeff and I are both assistants, technically we're not on the session. But that's the local level. The next level is the regional level, which is called the presbytery. That is made up of all of the various teaching elders or pastors in a various region. We gather together from different churches and are all accountable to each other, along with certain delegated ruling elders as well. We belong to the Nashville Presbytery of the PCA. So that's a regional gathering. Jeff and I do belong to that one. It's kind of weird. We're not on the session, the local level, but we are on the regional gathering of the presbytery, and we're also at the national one, which is all of the teaching elders and certain delegated ruling elders across the country, missionaries, etc., etc. Those make up the General Assembly, which is the national court or the national gathering. And so we have those various levels: local, regional, and national session, presbytery, General Assembly. So
roughly how many ruling and teaching elders show up at General Assembly?
This year it was close to 2,300.
Okay.
So
to give us a concept of how many people we're talking about.
Yeah, 2,300, which is a pretty good size, pretty decent. So helpful terms, we just teaching elder. Those are the guys who have been to seminary, been ordained. They are full-time pastors. They preach, they teach, they administer the sacraments. Ruling elders it's the same office, just a different function. That's at least how we take it in the PCA. They are the ones who also are overseeing the church. They are commissioned by God to teach, yes, to participate in shepherding the flock of God. That 1 Peter 5 language of being under shepherds. Ruling elders are those under shepherds to Jesus, and have a unique aspect of the office that teaching elders sometimes partake in, but we partake in together. So there's that. Commissioner. A commissioner at General Assembly is either a teaching elder or a ruling elder who has voting privileges. So a commissioner shows up in order to vote on the various things at General Assembly. An overture. We're going to talk a lot about overtures. An overture is basically a motion, more or less, that has risen through the ranks and has been brought to the floor of General Assembly as something that has to be voted on in order to take precedence across denomination. And the process of which, it's a lengthy process. Normally presbyteries bring overtures as a presbytery to General Assembly. Sometimes individuals can bring overtures. You have to be a teaching elder or a ruling elder, and it's fairly rare, but sometimes it happens. But anyway, it gets voted up to overtures. You vote on it on the floor of General Assembly, yay or nay. If it's voted up, then it goes back to the presbyteries and has to be voted on at the presbytery level. And if it receives that second vote, then it comes back for final approval and all of that. So it's a very lengthy process to kind of get anything done at the PCA, but that is what an overture is. It's brought before the General Assembly to be voted on, and then it launches into a process that normally takes about a year. Sometimes there are, within overtures, there's a committee that meets to basically look over the various overtures to give recommendations to help kind of move things along. Sometimes there's a split decision on whether we should accept or deny a particular overture or pass an overture or fail an overture. And so if there's a slight majority that vote one way, but there's another group that's fairly substantial, oftentimes there will be written up a minority report. And that minority report basically is like, hey, this is where we think the majority kind of miss it. You can offer this as a substitute motion, et cetera, and make this the main. So there's that. And then finally, a committee versus a commission. So there are two kind of groups that take place. We have committees. This happens on the local, the regional, and the national level. Committees are a group of people delegated in order to study a particular thing or give thought to a particular thing, and then come back and report that to the whole body, whatever that body that may be, local, regional, or national, and say, this is our recommendation. They have no real voting power. They're just there to make suggestions. A commission, and this is always so tricky. So committees are just giving suggestions. Commissions are commissioned in order to make pronouncements. So if we were to form a commission to oversee a particular ruling on something, what we're saying is that group or that entity has the rights to vote on our behalf. They're representing the whole as a smaller organization. Commissions are not super normal, but they are regular enough in certain cases. So anyway, so those are some helpful PCA lingo tools that you'll need to understand what's going on at General Assembly.
And I think that's helpful for a couple reasons.
Yeah.
As we kind of get into all of this, the main thing I'm thinking about is like, you hear a lot of headlines from other denominational meetings, because all the denominational meetings kind of happen in the summer, right around the same time. And it's very easy to say, well, we made this decision. And but when it comes to like our overture process, right, that doesn't, just because there's an overture doesn't necessarily mean that this decision has been made. Or that it's final. Right. Or we're, there are some hot button things that we're going to talk about. There are some hot button things generally discussed in overtures, as well we should, because we're talking about very serious things. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of these is like locked and loaded. That's right. However, what I think is also good to note in relation to certain other denominations, these are, like, when passed, like, we're changing the book of church order, or we're changing our constitution as denomination. And so there are certain things that are decisions that are made that are not just things that we think. Right. They are they are binding decisions that are made for the churches. And if the churches do not comply with those things, which generally speaking, I don't think is going to be an issue on any of these things. But as a lot of what the overtures are about are more or less clarification. Than anything else. Yes. They are binding. And so if the church does not comply with them, they are not necessarily welcome in the PCA anymore. That's right. That's exactly right. I think it's worth noting that, yes, it's a slower process. It's not as much of a hot button issue, but these are very, very serious things that do greatly affect the life of anyone in a PCA church. That's right. Frankly, probably more broadly than that. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, these are not suggestions that autonomous churches can either say, we like that or don't like it. This is the rule book, and if you don't play by the rule book, then you need to go play on a different team, sort of thing. And there are disciplinary processes for those who don't uphold the rules. So given that, PCA, the General Assembly, is not just voting on things, although that's most of what we're going to talk about today. Yes. It's also 2,300 or so men and their wives and children and just a bunch of people from everywhere kind of showing up in one
Yes.
place. So you kind of get a vibe of the
Yes.
denomination. You get a vibe of all of that. So what was your feel on that?
Yes.
As you were talking to people, you obviously have a lot of friends throughout the PCA.
Yes.
And all of that.
Yeah. So some people, like different guys, like GA for different reasons or dislike GA for different reasons. I enjoy, like, to a degree, parliamentary procedure. I enjoy the business of the church. Don't hear business of the church in a weird way, but like it's an organism and an organization. Those things are both true about the church. As an organization, you have to make certain decisions. When we make decisions, we like to do things decently in order because we are Presbyterian. And so I enjoy General Assembly because especially when we're in session making decisions, and all of the Robert's Rules and Book of Church Order and all of those things are swirling at once, it is like in the best way possible. It's like a 3-day, all day long chess tournament in your brain. And that's just a lot of fun. It's just a lot of fun. I really enjoy that. I enjoy getting to see so many dear friends from various parts of the country, and it's a growing number. That's also one of the fun things of being, this was my 3rd or 4th General Assembly that I've gotten to go to, and I've had connections with the PCA for, when did I start seminary? Wow, I guess it'll be 10 years this fall. So a lot of connection, a decade worth of PCA connections going back to seminary, a lot of friends. So a growing number. So it gets more and more fun the more and more people in the denomination. And the longer I'm in it, the more I'm like, the PCA is a really small world. So it's so wonderful to do that. There's an exhibit hall where you all different kinds of groups show up. A lot of friends there, a lot of really encouraging things from different institutions, seminaries, colleges, nonprofits. My neighbor, Nate Larkin, and the Samson Society was there, so it was cool seeing them. Bookstore set up, the Banner of Truth is there. Our dear friends over at Christian Focus Publishers and P&R, all of these, Crossway, they all show up, so that's cool too. So it's it's all of the fun things about that. But I think my favorite thing about it is there is a worship service each night, and in the PCA's understanding, that gathering of General Assembly is, in some sense, a reflection of a visible local church that gathers together that week each year. And so, it's a wonderful time where different groups are leading, but we're all there together. And so the first night, it was primarily First Presbyterian Church Chattanooga that was kind of overseeing things. And it's a little bit more like we're wearing robes. Gabe Fleurs, the pastor there, who phenomenal guy. He was at First Pres Jackson whenever I was at RTS Jackson. Brilliant guy, taught a couple of the ST classes I was in, and is like very big steeple, old school Southern Presbyterian, and so it fit that, and it was awesome. And then I wasn't able to make the second night, but the third night it was primarily one of the churches downtown Chat. Randy Neighbors was the pastor there forever. I can't remember the title, but it's a predominantly African-American PCA church. And so they were leading. Very different. And so the worship there was very different. It was awesome. One year, it was a Korean church, and so they sang in both English and Korean, and that was beautiful. So I love getting to be at the worship services where you get the full span of what the PCA is. I dearly love the PCA, and I love the fact that it is this big tent. This is for some people. This is not something that they're very excited about. I think it's absolute gold that the PCA is a big tent denomination, and so there's a lot of breadth of what it means to be a part of the PCA, relatively speaking. I mean, maybe we're not quite like the Anglican Church, where you can have basically Anglo-Catholic type things, and then the Sydney Anglicans, which are basically non-denominational churches, and they feel like it too. And I love those guys; they're great brothers. But anyway, the PCA is obviously a little narrower than that, but it's still fairly broad. Mm-hmm. And I love that we're not just kind of this. And one of my favorite things to do when I'm on vacation is to go to different churches and see how they do things and kind of get their vibe. And it's so good. But General Assembly, it's right there. And so that was wonderful. Overall, I think there was a lot of really sweet fellowship and camaraderie. Guys who have different perspectives, who are still dear friends. You see it all the time. Guys I went to seminary with and are still real close with probably voted differently on things than I did, and that's okay. I still love those guys, and they love me, and so I think granted all of the headlines, and it's one of the weird things. Like if you read a lot of the headlines or a lot of the people writing about the PCA's General Assembly, you'd be like, gosh, it's like a bloodbath in there. And almost everything that I've read about General Assembly that's like, oh man, that sounds like it was a really bad time, are written by people who aren't in the PCA.
Well, and I'll say, I come from a different denomination that is known for its very, very large, very, very large convention in the summer. And it tends to get heated, and it's very loud, and it's lots of feelings and thoughts and all these things. And so I tuned into some of the PCA GA, which is available online for free if anyone. And I believe it's still up now. Like if you, for whatever reason, want to go back and watch through 8 hours of people talking about overtures, it is there, and it was funny, like you said, reading some of those headlines that are like, oh, it was crazy. Obviously, they weren't watching the same live stream that I was watching, because yes, there are some contentious things. And again, like we're talking about things of incredibly important eternal matter. That we're gonna maybe differ on, that the Bible isn't necessarily speaking directly to how we need to, we're trying to engage biblical wisdom in that.
That's right.
And I think that one thing that was clear to me watching was that everyone who had an argument, whether or not they came down on different sides of it, everyone was very committed to engaging biblical wisdom.
That's right.
And
that's exactly right.
Like I said, there are things in here that are directly related to things that are happening in our day and age that aren't necessarily explicitly in the Bible, as clear as something like do not murder.
Right.
And so it's trying to engage, what does the whole counsel of God offer us? And how do we engage these things? And everyone seemed to be engaging in good faith on those issues.
That's exactly right. And
maybe not once or twice, and maybe we'll talk about some of that. But but generally speaking, I think that it was good faith arguments.
Absolutely.
Trying to engage the Bible well.
Absolutely. believe that wholeheartedly. I believe every commissioner there truly and actually believes the Bible. Because let's be honest, there's absolutely no reason to be in the PCA if you don't believe the Bible's the Word of God. I mean, there's so many other denominations, so it makes no sense. And now I will say, if if the headlines and the blogs and the podcasts and all of that were actually honest, and and they say, headline is like, the most heated moment at the PCA's General Assembly this year. If they were honest, truly, and I'm not joking, you want to get a bunch of PCA commissioners at General Assembly riled up, vote to extend debate right around lunchtime, and guys will lose their mind. It doesn't matter like what kind of context you serve in, where any of that. We come together in a uniform voice. Would you like to extend debate? And you'll hear guys go, no. And so truly, and I'm not joking when I say the most contentious and heated moments at the PCA's General Assembly, and this is every year that I've been, is when somebody wants to extend debate on a particular overture right before lunch. And so, again, these guys are doing things in good faith, and but yes, and they love each other. So
let's get into it.
Yes, let's get into some of these.
Do we want to cover any of the more dramatic things that happened just before GA? Just in terms of leadership this year.
So, for a very long time, Brian Chappell, whom you may know, was longtime president of Covenant Theological Seminary, taught homiletics there forever, has really, I think, written the definitive work on preaching, Christ-centered preaching. He was the stated clerk for the PCA for several years. I can't remember the exact number. A fair amount of controversy.
We don't have to rehash all of that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to acknowledge that as a
yes.
thing.
He, at the first evening, resigned from his role as stated clerk, effective immediately, and so is now honorably retired. He's in his 70s. He's had a wonderful ministry. Brian's going to be just fine. He teaches a fair amount still in various countries. So great man, love him. Sad that things kind of worked out the way they worked out for him. But anyway, so he stepped down. Right now we have overseeing this. The stated clerk normally has help within the denominations. So we have an ad interim stated clerk who has been there for a long time, knows the ropes, so nothing's falling through the cracks or been handed to somebody that is new to the job. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he's a ruling elder. Anyway, so there has been a handing of the baton, or there's about to be, I guess, a handing of the baton for who will the next stated clerk of the PCA be. But that has not taken place yet. So
great. Yeah, sorry, I know that was not on your outline.
Well,
but that was a little bit of a curveball, but I wanted to acknowledge that is something that happened.
That did happen, and it was newsworthy. So
yeah.
Okay, so now overtures. Another thing that will never make headlines is what the vast majority of overtures about. This year we had 50 overtures. The majority of them were either one, the reallocating, reassigning of different presbytery regions. So when a sudden population boost or a sudden growth of churches are being planted in a particular presbytery, sometimes it becomes prudent to take one presbytery and make them two, or to say, hey, there's a lot in this one presbytery, there's a lot of churches located here in the center. There's not a lot out here, and the presbytery that's closest to these kind of further out regions are there's not a lot in those presbyteries either. So what if we made this concentration a lot of its own presbytery, and then take these churches that are more on the periphery and put them in a different presbytery? That's the vast majority of overtures, which are, generally speaking, not contentious. We normally take those in omnibus, so we just, any objection, hearing none, moving on. Sometimes, and this is another kind of aspect, overtures are amendments to our book of church order that end up being really more semantic or grammatical. Can we have "and" here instead of "or"? That has to be brought via an overture. So between those two things, that makes up each year a pretty hefty amount of the overtures. So don't hear General Assembly as being like, oh, wow, they're talking about hot button issues. Most of the time, nah, we're not. So anyway, with that.
And worth noting that most of the things that we're about to talk about are more indicative of hot button issues than actually being hot button issues.
That's exactly
and that'll make more
right.
sense as we get to them.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, and some of these really even aren't like super hot button issues, but you kind of need to know about them. Like this first one. One of the overtures that was brought before General Assembly was limiting time and giving a little bit more of a direct course for pastors to go from being an assistant pastor to an associate pastor. So we have this is a fairly unique PCA thing from what I understand. We have a variety of classifications of pastor. According to our book of church order, we have pastors, we have associate pastors, and we have assistant pastors. Pastors are just generally what other denominations will call senior pastor, lead pastor. We use that term too. Senior pastor, lead pastor doesn't actually appear in our book of church order. They're just called pastors. Then there's this other classification known as an associate pastor. An associate pastor is not the lead pastor or senior pastor, but so they report in some sense to the lead pastor or senior pastor, but they are also still on the session. So senior pastors and associate pastors are both on the session with the ruling elders. In order to become a senior pastor or an associate pastor, a congregation has to vote on you being in that role. The other classification of an assistant pastor is, again, somewhat unique. Some people love it, some people hate it. It depends on who you ask. Assistant pastors are not a voting member of the session. So at the local congregational level, your assistant pastors have no voting rights at that church. And because of that, they're not voted in or hired by or fired by the congregation. They're voted on or hired by the session. They work for the session, basically. One of the reasons that we have that classification is sometimes it can be prudent for young pastors or new pastors to see if there's going to be a good fit. You hire a young pastor who comes in. Are you going to fit in here? Is this something that you're going to grow into or not? It also makes the process of bringing them on or them moving on to something else quite a bit easier. So with assistant pastors, there's almost an assumption that they're not going to be here super long. But there are guys, and this has happened in multiple places with multiple people who have been assistant pastors at the same church for decades. And that can become a fairly precarious sort of situation because you really have no control over anything, one. And two, you can kind of call it what it is, and this is sometimes what it's called in the denomination. You're not really called by a congregation to shepherd that congregation. You're a hired gun, for lack of a better term, a hired gun by the session to do the work of shepherding or whatever else they ask you to do on their behalf. And so if you just operate in this kind of constant state of assistant pastor, it becomes difficult. And so one of the overtures was limiting the time for assistant pastors to be assistant pastors. 5 years was what was suggested. Assistant pastors can be assistant pastors at a church for 5 years, and after 5 years, there's a reevaluation from the presbytery to the congregation, or that session, I guess I should say, to say, are you going to make this person an associate or not? And if not, tell us why. And if it's not a good reason, then you need to send them on their way so they can be an associate pastor someplace else, instead of stringing them along. So there is somewhat of a little bit of an association to say an assistant pastor is just somebody that you're dating, but you haven't decided to marry him yet. So don't string them along forever. One of the things that I think could have been really damaging for this, it failed. But one, I think it came from a good-hearted place of we want pastors to stay in one place for longer than 5 years. We don't want churches to look at pastors as a product that can be consumed. And so we don't want them to be strung along, et cetera, et cetera. We want guys to stay in place. One of the difficulties, though, with it is with that process, what you could have are guys who are just stuck in the assistant pastor role and are just tossed around from church to church to church. Personally, I think that's wildly damaging, especially to families. Most pastors will have to move more than simply across the street at some point in their career. Not all, but most. If you look at your wife and children and say, hey, by the way, there's a good chance that we're going to just have to move every 5 years. I'm always going to be stuck in a certain role, which means I'm also always kind of going to be stuck at a certain wage range. And we'll be here for 5 years and then we've got to move again. That's not a way, I think. That's not a really helpful way for churches to say to pastors, hey, one, we value you, but two, we want your family, especially your kids, to love the church too. I think that's a great way, actually, to raise kids that hate the church. So I think there was a good effort behind it. I think, it could cause some issues, though. So anyway, don't keep assistant pastors forever. That's really the moral of the story. Again, it didn't pass. So it failed, and that was left there. We did have two things that were brought up. These are a little bit more contentious. On worship, the nature of worship, Lord's Day worship, that are kind of indicative to some of the general feel, atmosphere of the PCA. We take worship seriously in the PCA. We're Reformed. Some
would argue too seriously.
Some would, maybe, yes, some would argue that. The regulative principle of worship is something we take seriously, something we believe in. That said, there can be, at times, almost a certain longing for a homogeny of what public Lord's Day worship looks like in the PCA. Okay. So a couple of overtures that were brought up concerning this.
So meaning when you say homogeny, meaning basically you go to any PCA church and you kind of know what you're going to get.
Yes.
As opposed to what you were saying earlier in the kind of description of different churches and kind of that, like,
yes.
You know, I went to a PCA church when I was in Jackson, Mississippi, that is radically different than Zion Presbyterian Church, let alone First Pres Jackson.
Right. Right.
So I think it's worth noting there, to what you were saying, to bring in a homogeny of worship across the PCA would be a massive undertaking, but B, would radically change the face of the denomination in a lot of ways.
I think so, and that's some of like the hushed undertones of conversations going on. There are some people that want that. There are some people that don't, et cetera, et cetera. So here are the overtures. One, the first was to vote that we revise a directory of public worship and make it binding. So, again, the PCA is somewhat of an anomaly as a denomination. We have certain binding things in the PCA. Obviously, the highest binding thing is Scripture itself. Inerrant, infallible, and inspired Word of God. That's what we believe. That's what our confession teaches. A second tier binding document for us is the Westminster Standards. That's our confessional statement. So what do we believe in the PCA? Find the PCA's Westminster Standards. And then third and finally, more or less the playbook of how we do a lot of day-to-day things that is binding are at least certain sections of the Book of Church Order. Not all of it is binding. There are certain sections and appendices that are not binding. But both the Book of Church Order and the Westminster Standards have directories of public worship. Most other, and this is true, so it's a fair argument that was brought up on the floor, really everybody else except for the PCA has a directory of public worship that's binding. The PCA does not have, even though it's included in our Book of Church Order and in our Westminster Standards, it's not binding. And so whether you do it or you don't, doesn't really matter. One of the overtures that was brought up is to revise our directory of worship and make it binding. So most Presbyterians in history have chafed against the idea of conscience-bound worship. So it's largely an Anglo denomination. It comes from Scotland, but was part of the Westminster Assembly. One of the reasons why the Westminster Assembly was brought up is an issue of worship, because the Anglican Church of the day had the Book of Common Prayer, which regulated worship. A directory of public worship is a middle ground between Anglican worship, which says, here's what you do, you can basically read your lines, and a Quaker Anabaptist view, which is like, you can do whatever you want. A directory of public worship is that happy medium to say, here are the various components that worship should have. It should have a call to worship. You should pray. A confession of sin is probably a good idea. You should sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. You should preach. You should pronounce a benediction. Like those. So it gives components. It doesn't tell you necessarily what you should do with those components per se. So it was brought up that we should revise our directory of worship and make it binding. That can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. I think in certain regards, it would be a good thing to have a little bit of clarity to say, hey, we agree that certain things in worship are biblical. How you do them, we can differ on, but certain things are biblical. You should gather for Lord's Day worship. You should pray. You should sing. You should preach. You should administer the sacraments. All of those are fine things. Great. One of my, and I think the general concerns around, and this is not necessarily what's happening at all, it's just a general concern about how is this going to shake out, is to say how specific are you going to make those various components? Do the benedictions, and how do you even define benedictions? A lot of the times the benedictions I've heard technically aren't benedictions, they're doxologies. Now to him who's able to keep you from stumbling. That's not a benediction, that's actually a doxology. So do we have to, is the Aaronic benediction the only one that's appropriate? Are you going to dictate that? There are some people who combine a line from a hymn along with, let's say, Solomon's benediction at the consecration of the temple. Is that inappropriate? How specific is it going to be? And so I think some of the general concern is to say, one, do we need this? And many people think yes. And granted, I think all of us think that could be helpful, maybe. But also, how specific is this going to be, and why? What's the motive behind it? Is it because you want us to all, let's say, and it's a beautiful church, I've worshiped there numerous times, but do you want us all to look like Independent Pres Savannah, which is, again, a very traditional Southern Presbyterian church? Or is there still room for Redeemer Pres Jackson? So I think that's a little bit of the concern. It was passed, so there will be a committee formed. I'm fairly certain that committee will have a broad range of perspective, and so I trust those guys. I think it'd be good. I don't know who's on that committee yet, but it was passed. So anyway, minimally contentious. Another one. The distribution of the sacraments. One of the things brought up, now there's a difference, and this was emphasized, and everybody agrees to this. There's a difference between administering sacraments and distributing sacraments. The only people who were allowed, this is everybody in the PCA believes this, the only people allowed to administer the sacraments are teaching elders or pastors. Ruling elders even cannot get up there and administer the sacrament. They can't, pronounce the words of institution. They can't baptize people. That's exclusively for teaching elders. Everybody in the PCA agrees on that. So there's no question here. We're not suddenly going to have Joe Schmo, Aunt Sally dunk, little Luke because he loves his Aunt Sally. Nobody is asking for that. Distribution, though. So more or less, who's passing the plate with the bread and the wine, or who, in some churches it's done differently. Who is the one distributing those things? Historically, especially in the Scottish Presbyterian tradition, various tables were set up and elders were the ones distributing or welcoming to that table. Here's a little insight. Most of the time we do, but not always. There are non-ordained people here at Zion and other churches in the PCA who help distribute the plate. there are some people who take issue with that, because overseeing, guarding the table, shepherding the flock, admitting them to the table, keeping them from the table, is a duty of the elders. That is true. We all agree on that. Some of the tactics or details of how that's done is not agreed on. So an overture was brought to the floor that only officers, specifically elders, sometimes deacons, if you have to, are able to distribute the elements. This was voted down. It failed, not by a lot, but it failed nonetheless. And so part of the indicative thing behind that is like, okay, I understand the concern. There are a lot of more charismatic type churches or non-denominational churches that whoever wants to baptize whoever can. We're just going to have a big baptism day. Here's our cow trough. Whoever you want to baptize you, they can baptize you because like it doesn't matter. And let's be honest, you're going to get baptized again. So like, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. My bad, guys. If you're listening to this and that was you, like it's fine. I love you too. But like anyway, but what's the reason behind it? There's some issue of worrying that will become that, or that there's not a strict enough oversight from particularly your elders of how the sacraments are administered. But anyway, that failed, so it didn't.
I mean, I think that's an important thing in the sense that, like, again, everyone's kind of arguing from biblical wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And trying to protect and guard against certain things happening, as you're saying, which is like a lot of the, like, even the little semantic things are, we're trying to set up the PCA for success, not just in 2025, but in 2075.
Yep. That's right.
That said, there is a very pragmatic element of this, which is that there are a lot of small PCA churches that maybe only have 2 elders or 3 elders. Right. And it's just not practical for all 3 of them to distribute to the entire sanctuary. Yeah. Which I think I would be willing to bet is an issue with Zion, where we have lots of people, but we have a relatively small session and a relatively small deacon staff. Yeah. And so selecting people who can distribute the elements, who are trustworthy, who are good, and really, I mean, thinking about the list of people who usually distribute our elements, all fit those qualifications, whether or not they're ordained.
That's right.
Is a pragmatic answer to that.
That's exactly right. Right. And so, anyway, so that's on worship. There were a couple things surrounding children, which is always wonderful. Like, children are not just kind of an afterthought of church life. So I appreciated these, that these were even brought up. So one of the first was a binding sort of examination, a more explicit examination process of admitting children to the sealing ordinances, allowing them to come to the table. One thing, welcome to the PCA, we baptize infants. We don't examine infants to be baptized because they're infants. We do examine children before they come to the Lord's table. So we don't take up the practice of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which has not really paedo-communion. Some people call it paedo-communion. It's not paedo-communion. Don't give babies bread. They'll choke. It's small child communion. So, but anyway, paedo-communion is not a practice in the PCA. It's not permitted. But with that, when do you allow children to come to the table? an examination process has to be brought about. There hasn't been an explicit set of like things that children should know before they come to the table. And so it was brought up that maybe this would be good and necessary, and this overture passed, that children should be able to basically understand and articulate in their own words really the membership vows, which are very straightforward, gospel-oriented questions. Do you view yourself as a sinner in need of a Savior? Do you rest on Jesus alone for salvation? Do you promise to uphold the peace and purity of the church? Submit yourself to the discipline of the church. These type of questions, so it's never explicitly stated in our BCO that these are things that children should be examined on. From my gathering, and this is Zion's practice, we always ask those questions because those are questions that you're asking children before they become communing members. So that goes hand in hand. So it was basically saying in this overture, you have to ask children, explain these questions to them, see that they genuinely understand what it means to come to the table, and that they understand these questions. And if not, they're not ready. I didn't think this one was particularly controversial because it just makes sense that that's what you would do. That's the practice here at Zion. Maybe it's not for other places. But anyway, that one passed.
Yeah, it sounds to me more like almost like a standardization of something that everyone's kind of already doing.
Yeah.
And then just kind of saying, yeah, we're going to make that, kind of write it down.
That's right.
Almost.
That's right. Now, it would preclude, not that this is even really a possibility, because there has been a study committee on paedo-communion. But if this overture now goes to the presbyteries, since it passed, presbyteries, it'll be voted on. I'm almost positive it'll pass, and then it'll come back next year and be written into our book of church order. But what this will do is it will preclude paedo-communion in an even more substantial way than it's been precluded now. So, but anyway, another one on children, a minimal age for voting. One thing that we don't have, there are a couple different kinds of members in the PCA to be a member of the church. We'll stick with the two most straightforward. We have communing members and non-communing members in places that practice infant baptism. Something like that typically comes up. Non-communing members are small children who have yet to profess faith in Jesus. They can't come to the table. We just talked about that. Children who can't profess faith in Jesus and aren't allowed to come to the table are also haven't taken membership vows. And so they're not a voting member of the body. They're a member in that they're to be viewed as part of this covenant community. But they aren't allowed to come to the table and they aren't allowed to vote. And typically, so my daughter, Adeline, she's 2.5. She is a member of Zion Presbyterian Church. She cannot vote. And you wouldn't want her to. I wouldn't want her to.
She would mostly vote for snacks.
She would 100% vote. But more snackies. Goldfish.
I mean, I have a daughter who also cannot vote.
Yeah.
Because she's 11 months old.
That's right. You don't want 2.5-year-olds and 11-month-olds voting because they don't understand and probably don't even talk very well. So, so what age should there be a minimum age for when, let's say, maybe you allow, and many churches do, they examine their children 5 years old. They're permitted. So here's a crazy thing. I was raised Baptist. Get that. I was raised Baptist. Some people don't believe that when I tell it to them, but I think I give off plenty of Baptist vibes. I was raised Baptist. I was baptized, and when in Baptist churches, when you're baptized, you're permitted to come to the table. I was baptized and thus permitted to come to the table at 5. I was 5 years old, which is about as close to infant baptism as you can get. But thinking back, like, yeah, I understood the gospel. Wonderful gospel-centered parents who taught me the gospel. So you can have 5-year-olds who can come to the table. Do you want them voting on who the next pastor is? ? It's a question that's brought up. And so that was brought around. There was also some legal issues. One of the reasons why this was brought up in certain states, in order to be a state-recognized organization, churches are 501c3s, nonprofit organizations. An incorporated organization, I guess I should say. In order to have the legal status of an incorporated organization, certain states have a voting body. Some would call it a board. That voting body has a minimum age in order to have that. And so in those instances, so that was one of the reasons brought up, is should we have this? Because there are certain churches that like legally might run into some issues. Ultimately, this failed. So there will not be a minimum voting age.
And I appreciated what the Overtures Committee kind of recommended with this overture, which was that essentially this would create 2 classes of membership within the body, aside from obviously the communicant, non-communicant members,
right?
Which is a biblical, we would say, is a biblical division.
Yes.
This would create kind of an arbitrary worldly division within the class of communicant members.
Right.
So I thought that was a really, really helpful way of understanding kind of what was going on.
Yes. It would have made the PCA even more idiosyncratic and nuanced and weird than it already is. And I think it's already by far the most idiosyncratic Presbyterian denomination ever. So, and that's a big statement. But anyway.
All right.
So
now we're getting into like the real stuff.
Oh boy. Okay.
We're an hour in, and we're getting into like the really heavy duty stuff.
Yeah. I'm finishing up my cup of decaf now, but I feel like I need to go get a nice steaming hot cup of tea, if you know what I'm saying. The kids understood that. If you didn't understand it, ask your kids. If you're not riding around with any kids right now, ask them when you come to church. They'll tell you. Okay. One of the big hooplas, if you will, of the 52nd General Assembly of the PCA were issues surrounding our ministry branch that serves in North America. What is M&A, Mission to North America, which oversees a lot of disaster relief, various community involvement, mercy ministries, and church planting. M&A oversees all of those things. There's a lot of issues, or people perceive there are a lot of issues, I guess I should say, within M&A. One of the things that people are divided on, one is the coordinator for M&A. His name is Erwin Ince. I know Erwin. I've actually met Erwin. He's tied with the RTS system, has done a fair amount of adjunct lecturing, and so I've met him while I was at seminary. He, just want to state this for the record, he is a precious, precious man. I love that guy. I think he's awesome. He's a fantastic preacher too. So, it's not like we got coffee or anything like that, but like we were in the vicinity together, and Anyway, he's a pastor in the was a pastor, is a pastor, I forget which one, in the DC area. So anyway, Erwin is. Some controversy has been brought up about Erwin's political views, some of his views on race. Erwin is African American. And so there have been concerns around that. I think most of, at least a good chunk of some of the contention were around some of his particular personal stances on certain things. There were some other issues that people brought up about how this past year has gone with M&A. A year or two ago, there was a goal set that we would, in the next 10 years, I believe, 10 or 15 years, plant 1,000 more churches. This past year, the PCA planted 40, which, it's not 100, so it's not on course to hit that 1,000 per this past year. But 40 churches is still a win, because 40s, this is just me. I'm trying to be a reporter here and be as neutral as possible, but I get excited about church planting, and so if anybody plants 40 churches, I'm super excited for that. I don't know too many people that'd be upset. Would I like to see 100? Sure, I'd love to see 1,000 churches in a year. Not super practical, but 40 churches is still let's praise the Lord for that. Can we praise the Lord for that? So that wasn't on track. A lot of, there was a fairly substantial deficit in M&A's budget for the year. If your goal is as lofty as planting 1,000 churches over the next decade or so, one thing you're going to have to do is spend a lot of money. So again, I'm not trying to make excuses or anything for anybody. Those are the issues. I don't think that those are ridiculous things. There's no, especially in that, there's no issue. I think nobody embellished any money. We're trying to plant as many churches as quickly as we can. And so resourcing that. If people don't agree because it's not fiscally responsible, I understand.
So it's not necessarily this isn't a moral failing. This isn't anyone stealing money from the church. It isn't, it's simply, we outran our coverage.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And whatever you do with that information is another issue.
That's right.
In terms of this, but it's not like a moral failing
That's exactly
of this particular person that they hit a deficit.
That's right. So there was a lot of controversy around that. Erwin was up for re-election as the coordinator for M&A. I think it's called a coordinator for M&A, to be in charge of M&A. And when it came time to vote on that, it was fairly contentious. He ended up being voted back in, so he continues to be. Separate from that, though, then the budget for M&A is also voted on the floor, which is another kind of weird idiosyncratic PCA thing. Normally a different commission, more or less, votes on budget, so you don't have 2,000 something guys looking at line items for different things, yet here we are. And a lot of voting on budgets, it was brought back. There was a tweet sent out by one of M&A's personnel, media people, surrounding issues with immigrants in America and deportation and that sort of thing. That was highly contentious and stirred up a big thing. So an overture was even brought up to have an apology sent and for those people to be fired. I think it failed. But anyway, so that was also brought up on the floor, specifically when it came time to vote on the budget for M&A, which I thought was a little bit strange. We're talking about dollars here, not about tweets. But whatever. So anyway, if I'm not mistaken, we passed the budget. Because basically if we failed it, then last year's budget would be the budget that we went with, and this year's budget was amended. So anyway, it was kind of confusing, but we passed it. Erwin is continuing to be the commissioner. Another thing surrounding M&A, and this was, again, different people on different aisles, I think both in good faith were coming to this. One of the things that we included, namely in the various demographics, reporting from various churches of how our church is doing, how our presbytery is doing, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that was actually added not that long ago was a demographic for ethnicity. It was brought up as an overture to have any sort of ethnicity demographic reporting basically stopped. And that passed, so there is no more kind of there won't be any sort of at least official demographics of what are the various ethnicities in the PCA. Now, mind you, even when we did have it for that fairly short span of time, it was always optional. I'll give the reasons for why we had it and the reasons why people had concerns about it. The reasons we put it in to begin with were because we wanted, as the PCA, one of our firm foundations, we want to be a Bible-saturated, Bible-believing denomination. We want to commit ourselves and believe thoroughly the Reformed Westminster Standards, and we want to be a denomination for the Great Commission. Those really are the three things about the PCA. You hear them all the time at GA. That component of being a Great Commission denomination means we are committed to reaching different demographic groups. And so one of the reasons why we included ethnic type demographics was to see, are we actually reaching predominantly Hispanic communities? Are we reaching predominantly African American? There is a very large constituency within the PCA that are Korean. What sort of resources should the PCA produce that is for the PCA in the Korean language or in Mandarin, because we have lots of Chinese churches? What sort of efforts do we need to be making to reach those various groups? That's why we included it, okay? I think that's noble. One of the reasons people took issue with it, though, is sometimes it could appear as though the PCA is becoming too concerned, let's say, with issues surrounding race, and are imbibing terminology that is inherently secular instead of gospel-oriented. And so a worry was brought up with those sorts of demographics to say, are we really looking for, to be a Great Commission denomination, or are we really just imbibing secular categories in a variety of ways? Again, both sides of that issue are brothers, I think, in good faith, trying to glean prudential wisdom. And at the end of the day, again, we voted to not have ethnic statistics kept for our rolls. So there is that, and those were the issues surrounding those things. Thoughts on that? Maybe not.
I'll say this as a layperson in our denomination,
Yeah.
as the Gen Z.
Yes.
reluctantly side of this podcast.
Oh, yeah. You are Gen Z. I forget that.
Technically speaking.
Yeah. So is my wife.
Though
so
I
it's
feel
fine.
like a boomer most of the time. But
Well, fair enough. I feel I'm split between Boomer and Gen Z. I've spent too much time with Gen Z, even Gen Alpha. That's ridiculous.
Yikes. I think that this is the feeling that I got listening to the conversation about this, again, reemphasizing the argument that everyone is making good faith arguments here.
Yeah.
No one is like accusing people of being racist or woke or whatever.
Well, some people are. But
some people are. But I think that if you read this in outside of the context of what was happening, it could be very easily saying, well, the PCA doesn't care about minority Americans anymore. It doesn't, whatever. That's not what's happening.
Right.
I will say, I feel like this is something to me that like 10 years ago isn't an issue.
Yeah.
Just, it felt very much, and again, this is me as a layperson, Seth, not as a representative of the PCA or even Zion Presbyterian Church necessarily.
Yeah.
Saying this, but just like it felt like something that, given the current cultural climate that we are in, became more of an issue than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
10 or 15 maybe.
Yeah.
And so I do think that's something important to note, that like there's no one here was like saying either we shouldn't be evangelizing certain groups, and no one was saying that we should forget whatever white people or something. That's not what was going on.
Yeah, right.
Though that could be some of the reporting that you see, and might be
that's
some
exactly
of
right.
the kind of quote unquote conversation around it.
That's exactly right. And when we brought up some of this statistics around ethnicity, and I forget what year it is, but and Sean Lucas, pastor of Independent Pres Memphis, brought this up when we voted this in not that long ago to start taking these statistics. It wasn't contentious at all. Because at that point it really was around, let's use at least certain sociological tools to say, are we reaching the nations, and what are some statistical evidences for that?
And in the interest of reporting rather than necessarily opining on all of this, but like there does come to a point that when you are doing something, if you start out with one intention, if it turns out that you're not achieving that goal,
right,
then you should change. If you are trying to communicate something, and the thing that the other person hears is something totally different, you got to change how you say it.
That's exactly right.
And it's very possible that this is one of those kinds of situations.
Yes, that's exactly right. So anyway, but that was voted out, so now we don't do that anymore. But let's see.
Probably the most clipped moment.
Yes.
And the most like controversial moment, which is really funny if you've seen it play out, if you've watched the video of it.
Yeah.
And I'll let you were there.
Yeah.
So I'll let you kind of talk about it, but kind of a discussion of how we present ourselves and decorum in this kind of general assembly.
Yes. So one dear brother, when we were actually discussing, we were discussing keeping statistics of ethnicity on our rolls, who got up and gave a fairly passionate speech, laced with biblical wisdom. It was good. He was a teaching elder. I forget where from. He is white. He's married to an African-American woman. So again, the accusation of him being racist is silly. He's obviously not. But he was ardently opposed to keeping statistics around ethnicity. Again, white man married to an African American woman. He's not racist. But some of the language that he was using around why we did it was geared towards motive. A lot of it was geared towards motive. And the moderator for this year's General Assembly was Kevin D. Young. If you don't know who Kevin D. Young is, then you haven't been paying a whole lot of attention to the world that we live in. But Kevin D. Young has written tons and tons of books, very popular pastor. Is like, well, anyway, he's an awesome guy. D. Young basically said he was out of order and asked that this brother would have some decorum on the floor as he gives any sort of speech for a motion or against a motion. One thing that's not regularly brought up is there were tons of guys calling for basically calling objection. And so D. Young, as moderator, heard the objection and said, they're right, have some decorum. D. Young was blasted for not letting him finish and for even interrupting and telling him he needs to use decorum. Fun thing, the language in Robert's Rules of Order, so the Book of Church Order is how we operate our ecclesial polity, but how we operate on the floor is according to the rules of parliamentary procedure given by Robert's Rules of Order. In Robert's Rules, using language pertaining to motive is called in Robert's Rules against decorum. So all Kevin D. Young was doing as moderator was saying, you are not operating in the rules of assembly via Robert's Rules of Order because you're attributing to the makers of this thing motive instead of addressing why you stand against it as a principle. You're saying they did this because they wanted to include DEI things or whatever else, blah 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 blah, or they were seeking to inculcate worldly categories. That I think was probably closer to what he was getting at. They were seeking to inculcate worldly categories into how we think of the church. According to Robert's Rules, that's not with decorum of how we address things on the floor. You can say, I stand in opposition to this because I don't think it's biblical as a principle, but you can't attribute motive to the reason for why it's there. And so anyway, a lot of the blasting for Kevin D. Young, I think, and this is not being so neutral, but like this is somewhat point of fact. It's been blasted across social media, but again, and this is well documented, Kevin D. Young was just doing his job and did a great job as a moderator. So that was that. Okay, more controversial things. One of the ways that we do things is we have overtures that are brought to the General Assembly. There is a committee called the Overtures Committee that is made up from different delegates from each presbytery. So there's a wide range of opinion, perspective, et cetera, that make up this Overture Committee. The Overture Committee gathers together early to sift through the overtures and basically say, as a consensus to help keep things moving along, what is our recommendation to the floor? Again, to limit the amount of time it takes, we have this Overture Committee, which is a microcosm of the General Assembly delegates, commissioners, to say, okay, what should we think about this so we don't have to read? I think the full document ends up being well over 1,000 pages every year. Help us think through this. the last overture, Overture 50, was on concerns and compassion for immigrants. Basically calling for a pastoral letter of some sort or a pastoral address, some sort of something that we could put into the hands of pastors and congregants and a variety of people that both shows concern and compassion for immigrants. The Overtures Committee and basically the Overture Committee didn't have time to actually thoroughly discuss this since it was the last overture. It was Overture 50. They ran out of time before we had to bring it to the floor of assembly. And so, given the current cultural climate that we're in, the Overture Committee moved that we would more or less table that discussion indefinitely. They didn't want to have to they didn't have time to speak to it or to give the body a recommendation as to whether they should pass it or fail it. So they said, what if we tabled this indefinitely? Which was the motion that was brought to the floor of General Assembly. Now, basically, to table it indefinitely means that we never really have to pick it up again. So it more or less kills the motion or kills the overture. There was much discussion. I think all from a variety of perspectives. I think well-intentioned. Ultimately, by a very slim margin, the body of General Assembly voted to uphold the Overtures Committee to table this overture indefinitely. I think a lot of people would have found it helpful to have something like this written up. I think also, if we had written something like this up, it would have been extremely difficult to have a unified voice, to do so with prudence and pastoral care, but also speak into a political climate that's very contested and split. And so it would have just taken a lot of nuance. So ultimately, I understand why we voted to table this indefinitely. Yet I still think it would have been helpful to have something like this. So anyway, there's my cards. But again, that's how we voted it. So it wasn't recommended that we fail it. Nobody said this is a terrible idea. The general consensus was, that's a good idea. I have no idea how we're going to be able to do that, and do it with the time constraint that we have. So there is that.
The part of me of this, like as a layperson, again, this is me kind of coming at it not as someone part of the General Assembly, someone who is just kind of reading this as news, hearing this kind of explained, that kind of thing. I think the part of this, because I agree with you, I think this would be incredibly helpful given where we are at currently in our political climate.
Yeah.
And again, I feel like this is something that 10 years ago is not as contested.
Right.
And is something that feels more like, as we've become more politically divided, more of an issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the thing about it that disappoints me is the indefinitely part. I would love to see this as someone who loves the PCA, as someone who loves the church.
Yeah.
I would love to see this picked back up, because I do agree with you. I think that this would be incredibly helpful as a member of the PCA to have a pastoral letter
That's right.
that is able to kind of speak to these issues.
Yeah.
The indefinitely part of that, frankly, it's a little confusing for me just as a church member.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because this feels like something that feels very important and maybe too important to table indefinitely.
Yeah.
But again, I am not a voting member of the General Assembly, and I do trust the people that we
That's
have
exactly
sent
right.
and are part of this. So
that's exactly right.
That's kind of my showing my cards there.
Yeah. Well, and I do think if we could like snap our fingers and craft the perfect letter, if the PCA could do that and it just like happen and everybody be like, that was so God honoring, Christ centered, gospel saturated, 2 thumbs up, we love it. If we could snap our fingers and do it, I think everybody it wouldn't have even been contested. The indefinitely part, so far as I'm aware, and basically from what I heard, was basically saying it's an impossible task for us, not even to like get to a place where we can apply the gospel here. I think everybody would have been, could in some way apply the gospel with concerns and compassion for immigrants in some sort of way. We could with one voice, arm in arm, say, immigrants need Jesus and care somehow. The details of how that plays out is the impossible part that basically, at least, I forget exactly what the numbers were, but it was a fairly slim margin, said, I just don't think we're going to be able to get there. So anyway, we'll see. It could get brought back up next year and maybe placed a little bit sooner on the overture list, but it was tabled indefinitely. Yeah. And then finally, concerns around things concerning Christian nationalism. Whew. So this actually brought with it 4 or 5 separate overtures that we basically took together as 2. So here's how we smushed the separate overtures together into 2 different categories. The first one resulted in what will become, given that Presbyterians voted up and then it comes back and all of that, a committee will be formed, an ad interim committee will be formed across the denomination that will write up more or less a position paper on Christian nationalism. Here's one of the huge concerns and like issues within the PCA surrounding Christian nationalism that this committee is going to be doing. 1, defining what it means by Christian nationalism. So that's a huge hot button topic. And things that can be constituted Christian nationalism span from what Bonhoeffer will call a certain form of Christian nationalism within the Nazi regime, all the way, which again, I think we could all herald Nazism within the church in World War II, bad. All the way to even the Scottish Covenanters in the 1600s, Samuel Rutherford, who wrote Lex Rex. Some would even call that Christian nationalism. But that's wildly different from Nazi Germany. So many of the Westminster Divines, some people might classify as quote unquote Christian nationalism. So that's like one of the issues with what the committee is seeking to do is say, okay, 1, obviously, we love the Scottish Covenanters. We love the Westminster Divines. Some of them have a different view of how the church and state relate together, both in principle and in practicality to how things work for the Presbyterian Church in America. If you want to call Samuel Rutherford a Christian nationalist, we're not going to call him that. We don't think that's helpful. So they're working to define Christian nationalism and address issues around it. Here is the Christian nationalism that they're going to define, I think, and take up issue with, to basically say, if this is how you view the church, the PCA is not for you. There are certain brands of Christian nationalism today that are honed in, not so much of church-state relationship, though that can be there. There's already been a pronouncement on Christian Reconstructionism. Christian Reconstructionism is not accepted in the PCA. Theonomy is another aspect that is also not accepted in the PCA. But what we're really getting at is the form of Christian nationalism that basically says, we want America to be a white European country overseen by the Presbyterian Church in America. So if you are brown or you have a different political view from us in a variety of ways, you are not welcome here, and maybe even the strictest form of the law is your punishment. So highly racial forms of Christian nationalism, what is called kinism sometimes, various groups that it's just intrinsically racist, is basically the Christian nationalism that I think is going to be defined and addressed in this ad interim committee. And here's why I'm pretty sure that that's the direction we're going, which the second thing that we ended up voting on was accepting a pastoral letter that was already written up first by the ARP, so the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, which was interestingly enough, it's one of the oldest Presbyterian denominations in America. It stems from the Scottish Covenanters, which some people think is quote-unquote Christian nationalist, and has probably a little bit of a different view of church-state relationship. So written first by the ARP and then accepted by the RPCNA, the Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America, which is also a group that stems from the Scottish Covenanters, both of which are about as conservative Presbyterian denominations as you can get. The RPCNA only sings psalms and does so a cappella. There's like 12 of them, but like that's what they do. They're very conservative. This is the letter that they wrote. Likely NAPARC, the North American Presbyterian and Reformed Churches, which is an association of a variety of Presbyterian and Reformed denominations, conservative, all of them, in North America, will likely take this up too. So again, the PCA didn't write this, but we're accepting it. It was written by the ARP and the RPCNA. States this, that the 52nd General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America join with our brothers in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church and the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America on this solemn day by condemning without distinction any theological or political teaching which posits a moral superiority of race or ethnic identity born of immutable human characteristics, and does on this solemn evening call to repentance any who would promote or associate themselves with such teaching, either by commission or omission. That sort of quote-unquote, call it whatever you want, Kenism, racially bound Christian nationalism, and both of those, the ad interim committee on Christian nationalism and this letter, more or less condemning that sort of racially bound Christian nationalism, was voted up by a supermajority, passed with flying colors. The chair for the Overtures Committee is Mel Duncan. Mel Duncan is a ruling elder, I think at First Pres, Greenville, South Carolina. Again, another tall steeple, very traditional, conservative, old school Southern Presbyterian Church. Nobody could lay a charge against Mel Duncan for being woke. When these were brought up, Mel Duncan said, it is the Overtures Committee that you vote this up in order to more or less undo this nuisance, which is within our ranks. That is this form of Christian nationalism. Again, we're not talking about the Scottish Covenanters or some of the Westminster divines that were a little bit more given to what's known as Erastianism or anything like that. We're talking about that racially bound sort of Christian nationalism that is now and likely will be unequivocally condemned by the PCA. So that voted up with a supermajority and very little contest. So all of that, it ended up being a little bit more of a contentious General Assembly than I thought. There were some issues of the day that were pretty big issues. I think, there were some pretty close split decisions, and then there were others that were not even remotely close. So there you have it. If you're still hanging with us, congratulations. Imagine doing this like 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day for a week. And that's General Assembly. If you really had fun with that,
become a teaching elder and go to GA next year.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, you could, or just
RTS is accepting applications.
That's right. Currently, I mean, lots of different wonderful seminaries. Yeah. RTS.
You just had RTS on your hat.
Well, so I've got my RTS hat on. I'm a proud RTS alum. My wife is a proud Westminster student, and I love what Westminster's doing. Our denominational seminary is Covenant Seminary. I love Covenant too. I wish I could do an MDiv at all three. So there you have it. But nobody has time for that. So pick one. Just pick one and go and do it.
There we go.
And
we'll be back later in the fall.
Yes.
With more things to talk about. If you have questions about this, please submit them to us. You can email keaton.paul@pcazion.org. You can leave a comment on Spotify, and we will discuss it on a future episode.
That's right.
Thank you, Keaton.
Thank you.